Very good afternoon, and thank you so much for having taken the time to join the webinar today. My name is Jay Reddy. I'm a cybersecurity expert here in Management. Guys, today's webinar is around a very specific topic at probably one of the most crucial points in time for IT as a vertical. We will be going through as to how to restructure your SIEM architecture. We'll be talking about building one if you don't have one, or if you already have one, how do you restructure it to align it to the NIST cybersecurity framework. That is the idea behind today's webinar. The webinar is being recorded. For those of you who want a copy of the webinar or any resources that I'd be walking you through today's webinar, you can just drop me an email and I'd be more than happy to share all the resources. My email ID will be available towards the end of the webinar. I'll share my email ID and other contact details. You can reach out to me for further information about the webinar or anything pertaining to cybersecurity. Once again, thank you so much for having taken the time to join the webinar. Let's quickly get into today's session. So the idea behind us putting together this session is essentially triggered from the fact as to the responses that we've been receiving from our customers and people around the world, organizations with which we've been working. Essentially, the whole landscape of cybersecurity isn't the same anymore. We're talking about a situation where remote working has taken center stage. So there are multiple aspects of cybersecurity that were holding good back in the day, don't hold good anymore. So we're talking about an extensive revisiting of your entire cybersecurity strategy. What do you do around that? And how do you align to the current scenario? That is the idea. So NIST is an organization that's been out there for almost about 100 years now, and they've been doing a pretty good job in giving out recommendations. What we'll do is we'll take into consideration their cybersecurity framework and kind of unpack their 55-page cybersecurity framework and see how does it fit into your SIEM architecture. That is the idea behind today's webinar, all right? So when it comes to working, the biggest challenge, like I pointed out a while back, is remote working taking center stage. Can you trust your employees is the biggest question right here. Now, when I say about trust, we're talking about a situation where the security of your organization is only as strong as the weakest link, in this case, your users. Now, back in the day, while your users were working from within your environment, things were absolutely okay. You had strong firewalls, you had strong rules, you had a SIEM solution, you had whatnot to keep tab on what's happening in your environment. But now, as we speak, the perimeter is kind of disappearing, or to be even more precise, the perimeter is kind of taking a different shape. Your user identities are becoming your infrastructure's perimeter. Now, why would I say that? Now, as we speak, most of the organizations around the world are switching to remote working and collaborating over the internet. Many internal applications are now internet facing, and more so, we're talking about users gaining access to many collaboration applications like Microsoft Teams, or probably for that matter, even the Zoom video conference app that we're talking about. Talking through today. Multiple applications are being provisioned for users, and with every new application that is being provisioned, it is one more opportunity for an attacker to strike at and get access into your system. So that is the biggest change in how your landscape has evolved. Now it's no longer your network security alone that has to be your concern. We're talking about identity access management also taking center stage along with network security. That is the biggest idea. So who gets what access? How do you fulfill their roles? How do you ensure that you do not compromise security for the want of accessibility or continuity of business? That is the biggest question right here. So through and through, the challenge is we've had users who don't understand security. We've had users who tend to fall victims for all sorts of scams. We've got users who click on an email that says do not open and download an attachment that says do not download. And in fact, these are the same set of users who write their passwords on a piece of paper or a sticky note and have it stuck right on top of their desktop. So what do you do? Through and through, the challenge is, do you trust your users? Now, you must have been hearing a lot about the whole idea with zero trust, where you start with no trust at all. In fact, that is one of my favorite frameworks. NIST themselves have put together a zero trust framework too. Probably towards the end of the webinar, I'll give you like some insights into that too. So through and through, the idea is to keep your touch points as minimal as possible, reduce consciously your threat surface area by revoking accesses that are not really necessary, and in the process also educating your users to do the right thing. So all of this seems to be a long shot because you have so many variables involved in the process. Now, my easy recommendation, based on my experience in the last 5 months, I've been working with many organizations around the world to set up cybersecurity strategies for them while they're working remotely. My experience is pretty simple. The NIST recommendations were my go-to solution. Now, when it comes to the whole framework, it can get overwhelming in most of the cases. So what I've done is I've broken the framework down into 5 components, and we'll see which of these components fit into your SIEM strategy. That is the idea. So let's kind of go on and consider what's the current state of infrastructure for organizations and how do you essentially tackle that. Now, it starts with this question. The biggest question right now is, can attackers be spotted like how they were spotted back in the day? Do your solutions work the same way they worked before? The simple answer is no. The honest answer is also no. You keep hearing about how many conglomerates around the world are falling victim. We keep hearing about how healthcare organizations are also attackers target these days because of the PHI that's there and the whole value of health record being stolen. We're talking about that. We keep hearing about that. Why is this a problem? In my point of view, this is a challenge because back in the day, while users are working from office, things were pretty straightforward. You knew what sort of transactions were these users doing with your resources, but now it isn't like this anymore. Your users don't work from your premises, and they work from their home offices, from their remote offices. And so to say, it could be as simple as an attacker tracking down one of your critical stakeholders, figuring out where they live, while they access your corporate resources through their home Wi-Fi. It becomes a piece of cake for an attacker to crack through the security. Now, this is commonly available information. That's the biggest challenge. We keep hearing about how critical stakeholders' home networks are being compromised, how this is the perfect ground for attackers to probably do a man in the middle. Now, through and through, it becomes all the more challenging because users tend to make mistakes when you give them multiple options. Now, when you try to restrict it to a few touch points, it becomes easy. But with the whole pandemic and remote working and collaboration taking center stage, the new applications are not doing any favor besides collaboration. They also are one of the major reasons as to why it becomes easy for an attacker to get into your system. So behavioral patterns are what attackers look for. They look for vulnerabilities. They just solve your users, socially engineer them, and get right into your organization. Now, all of this for what? All of this is essentially structured around any attack, for that matter, is around one key parameter, which is data. Now, when it comes to data, your whole SIEM strategy can be around how you handle data. We're talking about availability, integrity, and confidentiality. Now, when it comes to confidentiality, is how do you protect your data and who do you entrust your data with? So through and through, does your system have a provision to track critical users who've got access to specific data? Do you have a clear-cut scenario or a plan in picture that tells that these are the critical, mission critical corporate information available in my organization? Now, these are the list of users who have access to it. And I also have a tracking mechanism to notify when an unauthorized user tries to access these information. So that is the level of confidentiality that needs to be maintained over data. You will need to be at all times notified when a malicious actor tries to access a critical data. So your data access governance and your SIEM will go hand in hand way forward. That is the idea. When it comes to integrity, we're again talking about who is tampering your data. So attackers, if they're insiders, most of the time what they want to do is tamper their data for some personal benefit or for some reason such as they've gone rogue. You never know. So data integrity is again something that you need to monitor, and availability is again top priority in your cybersecurity strategy, because if your data is no longer available, if you were to follow the news, KPMG fell victim for this. About 2 weeks back, if I'm not wrong, Microsoft Teams data, their entire chat logs for every employee out there in the organization was wiped out. Now, this is a massive event for an organization, and that does cause a lot of strain because critical business information, customer information, so on and so forth, which will absolutely stall your business. So that again is important. So through your data access governance strategy, working with your SIEM, you'll need to understand that availability, integrity, and confidentiality, all three play an important role. So who has what access? When do they access and what do they use their access for? And how do you plan to keep your data available in the advent of something goes wrong? Now, why? Because of this obvious reason. I might sound paranoid, but the answer is quite obvious. We keep listening and following attacks all throughout the last 5 months. It's all around phishing attackers trying to exfiltrate data from your users, doing business email compromise, trying to do an account takeover. So all of this is just putting a lot more strain on the IT as such that's overworked these days. We're talking about the data breach costs going up. You see all numbers pointing to just one direction, where it's becoming easy for the attackers to get away with such an attack. And all of this because while your users are working remotely, they also have behavioral patterns as that of an attacker. What am I trying to tell you? Now here, we tend to log in at different times of the day because of the freedom that you've got with the remote working. Access to resources are not like how they used to be back at work. So it's becoming impossible for administrators and security folks to kind of find the needle in the haystack to figure out who actually is the attacker, and it's complicating the problem even further. So the cost of cyber crimes is fundamentally shooting through the roof because it's taking more time to discover, longer than ever before. So what do you do about it? It's increased this way. You've got all the numbers pointing towards direction. So what we're going to do is we've kind of understood the whole situation, and rather than panicking, I think taking control of the situation makes sense. And it's easy to do it if you have a guideline. And essentially the NIST framework that I'm talking about through today's webinar does that for you. So we've understood the current state of cybersecurity. We also figured what and how attackers are taking advantage. We saw the layers of cybersecurity. Now what we want to do is break down the NIST framework, which is a 55-page documentation. We'll see what are the 5 core aspects, and I'll kind of go through all 5 aspects of the NIST framework for the want of all of those who wrote to me that you wanted the 5 core functions. And we will see which functions align to your SIEM architecture. All right. So when it comes to NIST, it's pretty straightforward. It's a framework that's been established, or NIST as an organization has been around for 100+ years. The cybersecurity framework is a relatively a recent addition to the list of guidelines that NIST has given. One of the most looked up frameworks around the world. Federal agencies are in the US also tend to kind of follow these guidelines. It is not a regulation per se. It's not a compliance per se, but it's more of a framework and a direction, which when you follow, you tend to kind of fit into a lot of compliance regulations by de facto. That is the idea, right? So I've broken it down into 5 aspects. We start with identification. Now, identification can be the most tricky one because it has many moving parts. Figuring out what is your current posture is a very important aspect of your identification. You will need to not just find out what is important, but also have a value associated with it. Because in most of the cases, getting a sign off from your business stakeholders or from your management is difficult because there are no proper metrics associated with it. For us, it's easy to get away with, let's say, a qualitative metric saying it's high priority data. It's okay to do that, but in the long run, it makes absolute sense to sit with stakeholders, find out what's the quantitative value too. I'll talk about that in a bit. We'll also talk about protection, which is safeguarding your data that is available. So what do you do to protect? What mechanisms do you have in place? And detection, again, goes without saying, it becomes difficult to detect attacks these days. And how do you kind of find your way through the whole threat landscape and detect before something terrible happens? Your response is going to be a threat response. What actors do you have in picture to respond through a threat. And recovery is the last bit of it, which is a little far off from SIEM per se, but again, a very fundamental part of the NIST cybersecurity framework. So the first four aspects of it do work in tandem with SIEM. The last one is recovery. I think it's important to, I'll walk you through and I'll give you a glance of what's recovery. Now, when it comes to identification, like I told you, NIST wants you to develop a clear-cut strategy to find out where your risk lies. So what are your riskiest assets? Which are your riskiest users? What sort of damage can you control, and what sort of damage can you sustain? That is the question that you'll need to answer. Now, when it comes to identification, risk assessment is probably one of the most important things you need to start with. Many times risk assessment, it passes off as an optional step. Most of the cases, right after an attack or when there's an organizational digital transformation, that's when risk assessments happen, and they don't happen frequently. That's a big no-no from my side. Do your risk assessments regularly. In fact, I'd say 3 months once, as to considering the fact that the landscape is so dynamic. We're talking about figuring out what are potential threats to your organization. Where do your vulnerabilities lie? How likely are you to be attacked? Depends business to business, what the criticality of the data that you hold, the value of the data that you hold, you'll be able to arrive at what likelihood of attack you'll be under, and then what is the impact on business, or how does it stall your business. So you'd have a fair bit of understanding if you broadly answer these 4 questions, but it starts with understanding what needs to be protected. To answer all those 4 questions, you need to identify where does your risk lie. Which of your asset can potentially be vulnerable to a threat or a breach. So you need to identify that. And it does come with a cost. It is a long and tedious process, but in my opinion, probably one of the most important decisions that an organization should take and get a buy-in for and start with. We're talking about documenting the whole thing. It's not about just finding out, but documenting and letting the right stakeholders know. In a couple of instances where I worked with, the challenge is if you're an organization which relies on an external vendor, let's say a DRAS, disaster recovery as a service, you could rely on vendors at multiple levels, or MSPs for that matter. What do? You need the right stakeholders on board at every time, and you will need to know and walk through and run through mock-up scenarios to find out who will play what part. So risk assessment isn't, in my opinion, a reactive process. It's more of a proactive process. So even before something happens, you'll know who are the right stakeholders, what are the risks that are involved, which are the data that you need to identify and protect, what is your mission critical data again, and what's the likelihood of its harm. You'll need to be able to find that out. So here, what we want to do is we want to start off by prioritizing the assets. Like I told you, that's the challenge, right? I've taken one example right here. I know a couple of you who are joining today are healthcare organizations too, so it might make sense. I have an extended list of protected information or critical or sensitive information based on industries. Just in case if you are from a different industry, just drop me a message towards the end. I'll send you the list of PII that is pertaining to your organization and that's relevant and important. In terms of prioritization, here you go. This is how I do it. If you start an exercise with your organization, with your stakeholders, you start with a table as simple as this. You find out what are your assets, what are the values of these assets, what sort of damage can it sustain, or what sort of loss can it create, what are potential threats, or where are entry points for your attackers. If there's a damage, what's the likelihood of the loss for business, for reputation. There are a few qualitative values too, but please do make note of them. And how do you prioritize your protection? Now, this part is quite important, because in most of the cases, while you are underway carrying out a recovery, it stalls your business, it stalls your business from going up and being back, only because you try to back up everything, you try to recover everything. That's a big challenge. So you need to identify what is priority, what is mission critical data, what you can afford to lose. So having that clearly done makes a lot of sense. So here it's very straightforward. I've done it for healthcare organizations. You can also try for other industries. It does make sense to do this exercise. You'll know where to focus your efforts. You'll know what to monitor. You'll know what all dashboards you need to be building for your stakeholders, for your management. That is the idea, to prioritize asset. And in my opinion, doing this manually can get a little tedious. If you have out of the box reports, nothing better than that to find out exactly what are you looking for, what are potential threat vectors, who are the riskiest users, where are your riskiest assets lying, what sort of behavior do you look at, log on failure as a behavior, account activities as a behavior, ones that are locked out and passwords being changed unnecessarily. Such sort of user behavior and activity and a bird's eye view on malicious intents gives you that edge over how do you prioritize attack, how do you figure out what sort of threats can you be faced against. So it's very clear, very straightforward. Having a dashboard does a lot of help. So identification is the first part of it. Here, identification is identifying what is your data access governance strategy. How do you classify your data? How do you prioritize it? How do you assign value to it and have a dashboard that gives you potential vectors of threat? So that is the first step from the framework that you can incorporate into your SIEM strategy. The next one is protection. Again, it's a very straightforward one. I am going to give you proactive approaches to protect based on what we just identified. So in most of the cases, as I see, as I've been working with people, Active Directory still remains the preferred identity access management platform, but it does have a lot of shortcomings again, does it not? And we were just talking about the whole revamp in or reimagination of your perimeter, where your users are your perimeter, and the first line of defense for users and their identities is password policies. Now, do domain password policies do the job? Simple answer, no. They've been stale. They have been sitting around for almost about 2 decades now, and there's been no considerable change. You can think about other options like GPO or fine-grained password policies in your Active Directory, but they do keep falling short. They do not answer basic limitations to passwords, and why attackers take advantage of them. Pretty straightforward. It's a one-size-fits-it-all approach. Does not take into account incremental passwords and stop users from using that. Does not prevent a dictionary attack. Very fundamental. And all the more, NIST does recommend you to not have expiry. Now, this might be contradicting to a couple of you people. I'm pretty sure for a long time we've been considering password expiry as a good thing, but turns out, as to how things are right now, password expiry can be a potential reason for most of these attacks, because users tend to go through what's called password fatigue. The more you ask them to reset, the more accounts that you provision for them, the easier their passwords keep getting for attackers to crack. Users eventually tend to set weaker passwords so that they don't need to go through the whole process over and over. They try to make it simple for them, but turns out that is one of the main reasons why attackers have a field day walking to your organization and walking out with all your data. So through and through, it becomes very difficult for organizations to prevent a password spray attack, because simple passwords, one key and multiple accounts get opened up or like cracked open so easily. And through, Microsoft themselves have come out with a clean infographic that says cracking through your network security isn't as difficult as you would imagine. If just one of your accounts is compromised, even before you know, your domain admin can go down. And the worst part is, like I earlier pointed out, the whole deal with exfiltration of data and it taking more than 5 months to discover that something's gone wrong. That is the idea. So through and through, what we want to do is we want to like build policies, set options around strengthening your password policies. This is for the whole deal with protection. So if you're looking at a cybersecurity strategy, ramping up your password policy does make sense. Look for solutions that do this. Stop dictionary words, stop patterns, stop incremental passwords. Do not let your users use previously used passwords. And in fact, my standard one, go-to one is always passphrases. They have a greater entropy, so do look at that. And again, along those lines of security best practices, do enable MFA if you can. Now, I'd want to take a moment to talk about recon. So attackers do recon in your organization to find out what are your valuable resources. Now, if you're an organization that just fast track your way into, let's say, Office 365 or move just to the cloud, right? If you're an Office 365 organization, do this for me, please. Now, toggle open a new tab and search for Secure Score. Now, if you're already logged into Office 365, you should be able to access the Secure Score dashboard. And the Secure Score dashboard gives you a very realistic picture of what is your current security posture. I start here. I would need to understand where are my potential vulnerabilities? What am I obviously missing out in my organization? What are the infrastructural joints that are not as strong as they supposed to be? Secure Score dashboard, if you've logged in, you would be able to see your score. Usually the score baseline is from, let's say, 500 to 700 based on the maturity of your infrastructure. Now, if you have probably, let's say, a secure score of 200 or less, I would not call it a great posture. If you have anywhere between 400 and above, it's decent, it's good, but it's always a process, isn't it? You move towards a higher secure score. That is the idea. It gives you a list of action items. That is the best part about the Secure Score dashboard. It gives you a detailed list of action items that you need to be looking at. And if you are looking at it right now, you would see multi-factor authentication right on top with a score of 50. Now, what I'm trying to tell you right here is SIEM is definitely both reactive and proactive, but it does not make sense if you haven't foolproof. So do turn on MFA if you can. Microsoft Mobile Authenticator, you have multiple options that are free and readily available. Do take a look at it and turn on MFA for your accounts, because we are talking about the first line of defense, which is your identities and security for identities. So turning on MFA is a very fun thing to do, because it kind of undoes everything that an attacker would imagine. So if an attacker cracked through your account, let's say an administrator account, they'd hit a wall right at the login if MFA is established for your Windows logon and or your Linux logon. That is how cool it is. And they'd not be able to proceed further without a verification code. Now, why bother about all of this if this is enabled in your organization? So we were talking about phishing attacks on the rise and how accounts are being taken over. Though if passwords are compromised, they wouldn't be able to proceed further without that second factor, the obvious one, which is the email factor right here, where verification code gets sent and the admin account is accessible only after that. And while working remotely, it is a lot more useful because credentials get shared across organization and it can be all over the place. Even before you know, many users tend to have hold of these credentials. So along those lines, so do have an MFA in place. So we've spoken about two aspects of the cybersecurity framework. The first one was a SIEM aspect, which is identification. The next one was more on the lines of identity access management, which is protection. We just saw what to do, and detection. Again, getting back to SIEM, detection is going to be a thing that you'll need to take into account. And how do you do it? Audit trails always does the job for you. Having a clear-cut mechanism, because when you want to do a root cause analysis, mitigate an attack, or contain the damage of an attack, you would want data or history that tells you what went wrong, where did it go wrong. That is the idea. And when you do this with your existing infrastructure, let's say Office 365 or Active Directory for that matter, there are innate limitations. Office 365 has a 90-day cap. Active Directory has a 4 GB cap, and event logs are like an ocean. So how do you manage to wipe out event logs or not store audit data and still do these root cause analysis? Like I pointed out a while back, since it's taking 5 months to actually even discover that an attacker is existing in your system, does it make sense to have such limitations to curb you or to handicap you? So start looking for solutions that like completely remove that cap off, and in the process also look for solutions that can give you context to every auditing that you do. What am I talking about right here? Now, something as simple as logon activity being tracked can give you multiple levels of information. Now, logon activity can seem like a very simple thing to track, but when done right, when put into context, you can essentially crack open a lot of attacks, and you can actually break down a lot of attacks in terms of logon activity, let me tell you. Now, brute force attack, for example, let's take. A brute force attack is repeated logon failures in under a minute, let's say, followed by one successful logon, and then first time access to a critical file or a folder or a server, followed by a first time installation of software, which starts sending out packets of data back and forth. Now, this is how you should be able to correlate and put together scenarios. So log on activities, log on failures, log on success, first time accesses, when they're looked at separately as silos, when you look at them, you wouldn't make sense. Those would be just pieces of information with no context at all. But if you can draw all of them together, align all of these dots together, you would have a story. And we started with something as simple as log on activity tracking, success and failure. If you had the right inputs, you'd be able to draw the story behind what had happened. So is the case with non-business hours. So is the case with remote desktop activity, and a common behavior of attackers, island hopping or lateral movement. Attackers don't just stop with one account. They want as many accounts as possible. They want to compromise as much as possible, take over as much as possible for two things. One, more access, more resources. For number two, to hide their tracks, and it becomes impossible for organizations to figure out where is your attacker lying at this point in time. So doing this, the attacker started with an initial foothold. They, with basic credentials, trust me, with just the domain user credentials, a user would be able to do an LDAP query and find out where is your domain admin. It's as simple as that. The Active Directory architecture is like that. And right after the initial foothold is established, they want to try and establish access to more devices. And by the time, in span of 2 days, like the infographic I earlier showed you, the domain admin is compromised and your entire network security is down. So what do? You audit. You keep track of any malicious activity, anything that is deviation, you get notified. Some users being moved, deleted, permissions being altered, privileges being modified, you should be notified. Any sort of critical change, as we term it, should be audited and tracked and reported. That is the idea. I have a list of 25 Active Directory event IDs. Now, these are the event IDs that you'd want to track. Things like log on, log off activity, things like your remote desktop activity. Going further, access on files and folders for file integrity. So I've got a list of 25 events that you need to track. You can turn on get your Active Directory auditing module or your event viewer and turn on auditing for these functions. Do remind me at the end of the webinar, just drop me an email. I'll give you my email address. Do write to me and I'll share the list of 25 event IDs. It's a great place to start for auditing. Probably quite comprehensive also, I'd say, considering the remote situation in the picture. So auditing, you've got a couple of out-of-the-box reports right here. So do look for solutions that help you go head first when you are tackling an attack of this sort. And auditing does make a lot of sense when you are doing a root cause analysis. So now we've kind of got the picture as to how to detect, identify, and audit and keep track. Now, how do you respond? And that again is a question. Now, the whole idea is you would want to minimize your response time. You'd want it to be automated. That is the whole idea, right? You'd want to respond ASAP, not wait for someone to step in, turn off something or kick out a user. You'd want the response to be automated. But for that, does your system stand at a juncture where it can find out false positive from an actual attack? That is the question right here. So you'd want to start with mitigating threats. That's understood. You'll want to notify the right stakeholders, whoever is involved, whoever is going to help you solve this problem. You will also want your system to curtail the attacker, triangulate the attacker, stop and kick them out, or disconnect their session, or turn off their system, or block their IP. Some sort of measure has to be taken by your system. And it happens with the first step, which is investigating an anomaly. So your system has to be smart. It can't be based on threshold values. Maybe back in the day, it worked for you with threshold values or blanket values set for various events, but now that's not the case. We're talking about users logging in from different geographies, different times of the day, different IP addresses, using different devices, personal devices, home networks. The whole landscape is chaotic, no doubt. For your system to be able to work with threshold values, it becomes next to impossible. So for detecting anomalies, it does need intelligence. When I say intelligence, we're talking about user behavioral analytics. Can your system investigate anomalies and call out a deviation in behavior from a normal behavior? That is the question. So investigating anomalies is what your system needs to do. And it can start with something as simple as privilege. Now, attackers always go for privileged account. They look for privileged accounts. They look to target at these accounts that have the keys to the kingdom. They try to right after they get hold of these accounts, they initially start with a recon, find out other accounts and escalate privileges for them to hide their tracks. So you will need to be notified when privileges are used for the first time. A new account using a new privilege on a new entity in your organization, you need to be notified. So here there's a context to the message that administrators receive. It's very straightforward. It says the user J has never done this activity. 0 is his base value, and all of a sudden J does 10 activities, which is a critical activity right here. So this is the kind of info that you need to get. So I have context at every level based on the volume of activity or the activity itself that I'm performing, giving me a clear picture as to this is a privilege abuse, because it gives me context, gives me reason, tells me what is the deviation from normal behavior. So is the case with malicious logins. A weird time in the day, non-business hours, log in from an IP address that was never flagged in your system, logging in from an IP address that has a poor reputation, logging in from a blacklisted IP, or accessing your resources from a device that was not tagged in your system. All of these get factored in while we are trying to do user behavioral analytics. We draw risk scores for users and risks profile for users. So every user, every behavior is tracked over history. Historically, all such information is taken into account, crunched, and the system should be able to identify that J, the user, never logs in at 5 a.m. in the morning. J starts his work at 10 a.m. and does till 7 a.m. So this is a deviation in behavior, and this is followed by accessing some critical data or a file or a folder and tampering that. So that level of insights as to who, when, where, and what are they accessing is required. So user behavior analytics does come in handy when you're trying to defend against attackers who are difficult to spot. So through and through, think about it, user behavior analytics can work in your favor, can find out malicious logins, can find out malicious privilege use, can find out first-time installations of files and folders, or modifications done or integrity of your folders and critical data being tampered if it is malicious, if it is anomalous, it would get tagged. So we've kind of come to the fifth point. We were just talking about detection right now and how do you detect a malicious intent or a malicious activity. The last bit of it is recovery. So what do you do? So right after you respond, right after you detect, you want to recover, right? So through and through, an automated incident response system is something that you need to look at, something that kicks in when you're not around, something that starts working when you are asleep. That is the kind of system that you need. And in the process, you will also want to foolproof as much as possible. Even if something goes wrong, terribly goes wrong, you can't be 100% sure. No matter what you establish, there could be an attacker out there who could crack it. If there's a technology, there's an attacker out there who can crack open it through. So we're talking about recovery and making our stand clear. Now, when it comes to recovery, it's very straightforward. All of these regulations, I have so much data that just asks you to get going with a clear-cut disaster recovery plan and a data recovery plan. What I want you to do is I want you to take into account one simple recommendation. I give this to a lot of customers with who I work. It's called the 3-2-1 backup rule. Now, hear me out clearly. Make 3 copies of all your critical data. Store 2 of these copies in different physical drives or different physical formats than your original one, and store 1 of your copies in a different geographical location or probably on the cloud. Now, this is called the 3-2-1 backup rule. No matter what sort of damage are you put through, many a times this does come in handy. At least 1 of your copies is going to still remain at the end of it to help you get your data back. And along those lines, what I'd want to point out is also a clear-cut strategy on your disaster recovery planning. Now, do have the whole thing documented. When you're implementing a plan, you'd need your SIEM solutions, you'd need your cybersecurity folks, your disaster recovery folks, your vendors with who you're working, your identity access management team, all of them on the same page documented, because right after an attack, the biggest challenge is not to panic. Now, you need right documentation that points you to the direction where you start, what you do, who are the stakeholders, do mock runs. Figure out if you can do mock runs, simulate situations, because a risk plan or a disaster recovery plan is incomplete without a realistic test. Most of the time it's just theory. So do not stop right there. Do reevaluate your plans and check if you can have a strong DRP also incorporated right at the very beginning. All of these regulations just point you right there. In fact, the cybersecurity framework is a great place to start. If you're looking at achieving the framework, my recommendation to you would be through AD360 and Log360 solutions that Management offers. You want more information, I can give you, just write to me. So I'm going to quickly sum up what we discussed through today's presentation. We started with the cybersecurity framework, and we wanted to kind of map which aspects of the framework go in tandem with your SIEM strategy. I've also walked you through some bit of IAM and data access governance. So if you see right here, it starts with identification, where you start with a clean governance strategy. You have a clean end-to-end risk assessment strategy to find out where your risk lies. What are the business value associated with those critical information in your organization? What's mission critical? Who are the riskiest users? You find that out. And when it comes to protection, awareness, and training, like I said, educating your users is important. Asking them or stopping them from clicking the wrong link can make a lot of difference. And when it comes to data security, you have layers to data security in terms of availability, integrity, and confidentiality. What do you do about that? How do you get your DAG access governance strategy to work with your SIEM on the whole? So what sort of tracking do you establish? What sort of file integrity monitoring do you do? So your data security, again, is important. Along those lines, just a quick reminder, we were talking about the secure score dashboard. So do look at it. There are DLP rules as well, data leak prevention rules as well in it. If you haven't enabled them, do enable them, because Office 365 turns out to be the most attacked platform in the last couple of months. And it's because a lot of us fast-tracked into Office 365, forgetting a lot of checkboxes. So do check the secure score dashboard. When it comes to anomaly detection, it doesn't make sense to do it the old school way, which is threshold values or benchmarks and baselines. Do it through user behavior analytics and machine learning. Does give you that extra mile, an advantage or a head start against the attacker to call out both insider attacks and external hacks alike. You'd be able to do that with anomaly detection. And yes, your response planning is again quite important. What do? You have a 360-degree response plan, bring in all stakeholders together, get them all to sign off, get on the same page, get your IAM, get your DAG teams, get your cybersecurity teams to all work in tandem to create realistic disaster recovery plans. And once that's done, I think pretty much you've got a tight ship right here for your cybersecurity. And that is how you align your cybersecurity strategy for the NIST framework. We understand that security threats are real. We are here to help. My email ID is right on the screen. What I've done is I have put together a couple of resources for organizations to get a head start. I have the list of 25 event IDs that I was talking about. If you're looking at auditing Active Directory for while you're working remotely and aligning to NIST, we've got an ebook that details, that kind of breaks down and unpacks the 55-page cybersecurity framework that NIST has put together. We've kind of made it easy. It's more like a playbook. That's how we've done it. We've also put together a couple of more resources around aligning to guidelines specific to industries. If you're into healthcare, let me know. If you're into finance or government or banking, do let me know. My email ID is right on your screen for the video, for the presentation deck, or for any other resources. Or if you have any question per se, do write to me. My name is Jay Reddy. My email ID is right on your screen. Guys, you've been such a lovely audience. I'm going to be sticking around for some more time to take your questions on the chat. Do let me know if you want me to explain something or anything specific. I'm available for questions. Do write to me at jreddy@manageengine.com. I'd love to have a conversation. Just one quick request. All of you, do stay safe, take good care. Next time when we meet, I hope we meet under better circumstances. Guys, you take care and stay safe. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.